I'd like to begin by thanking Engen Osberg, Sam Markison, and Bill Culver for inviting me to be here with you, and to Victoria Wu, Brigitte Farah, and everyone else for making the arrangements and taking care of the details. I'd also like to acknowledge Valley and thank it for sponsoring this luncheon. I'm honored to have been asked to deliver this year's Fathi Abashi lecture on historical metallurgy. I've not had the pleasure of meeting Professor Abashi, but I am in awe of the scope of his work at Université Laval and in Canada and many other countries over the course of his long career in industry and academia. I'm also very appreciative of his commitment to the history of metallurgy, which is the reason I'm here today. In my own way, I've made a similar journey to Professor Habashi, though perhaps in reverse. I began my career as an historian of Canada's foreign relations, but over the years I've been drawn to an interest in mining and metallurgical projects and their political, economic, societal, and international importance. I am, in fact, in the final stages of a book project on INCO, the International Nickel Company of Canada, in New Caledonia in the 20th century, and it's this topic that I will discuss with you here today. Many of you, I'm sure, are at least passingly familiar with INCO, which was bought by Valley in 2006, and its Goro project in New Caledonia. This was a project to produce some 40,000 tons of nickel in New Caledonia's south that experienced some difficulties over the years. 2 years ago, Vale sold the Goro mine and facilities to a consortium in New Caledonia. But I'm not here to speak about the Goro project, as interesting as that is. Rather, I'm going to discuss INCO's involvement in New Caledonia from the early 20th century to the 1990s, i.e., before the Goro project got started. This lesser-known part of the story is interesting and valuable on its own, but I believe it also helps us understand why INCO, and perhaps later Vale, struggled with Goro. History matters. INCO's connection to New Caledonia went right back to the company's founding in 1902 as the International Nickel Company. At that time, New Caledonia, a French colony in the Pacific, east of Australia and north of New Zealand, was the world's largest producer of nickel, though it was shortly to be overtaken by Canada based on the production from the nickel deposits of the Sudbury Basin here in Ontario. INCO was created by merging 7 different companies, the 2 most well-known being the American companies Canadian Copper and Orford Copper. But the merger also included the United Kingdom's Nickel Corporation and the Société Minière Calédonienne, 2 companies that had concessions in New Caledonia. Those Caledonian concessions were invaluable to INCO, but not for the nickel that they contained. INCO already had all of the nickel it needed to dominate global production for decades to come in the Sudbury area. Rather, those New Caledonia deposits were important politically because they helped INCO rebuff demands from the government of Ontario to refine the ore it mined from Sudbury domestically, rather than export it to a refinery in New Jersey. This was the so-called nickel question, and it occupied a significant place in Ontario and Canadian politics in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Because it owned concessions in New Caledonia, INCO's threat to stop mining in Sudbury and move its entire operation to the French colony contained at least a whiff of plausibility. In effect, New Caledonia served as a nickel-rich foil that enabled INCO to ignore political pressure to increase its value-added processing in Canada, at least until the threat of export embargoes or even nationalization during the First World War led INCO to build a refinery at Port Colborne between 1916 and 1918. That settled, INCO no longer needed New Caledonia, so it sold its concessions there in the mid-1920s. But the interdependence between the company and the territory continued. Indirectly, New Caledonian nickel remained subject to the world price for nickel established by INCO because of its market dominance. And in the 1930s, INCO also had an informal arrangement with Société Le Nickel, New Caledonia's biggest company, that guaranteed SLN markets in Europe and a higher price for its nickel that helped the French company, and New Caledonia more broadly, survive the difficult years of the Great Depression. For its part, INCO benefited from this arrangement by pointing to Le Nickel as a significant competitor, enabling the North American company to beat back antitrust allegations in the United States. More directly, during the Second World War, With Le Nickel's markets and refineries in Europe occupied by Germany, INCO bought and refined New Caledonia's nickel and helped to keep the territory's economy, as well as the company, afloat. With INCO's help, therefore, Le Nickel began the post-Second World War years firmly ensconced as the biggest company in New Caledonia's nickel industry, with an oversized influence on the colony's economic and political affairs. And as the industry grew, fueled in the early 1950s by military rearmament, as a result of the start of the Korean War, growing demand from new and expanding industries, including the automotive and the airline industries, Le Nickel expanded with it. Yet Le Nickel's prosperity and expansion in the 1950s and early 1960s strengthened New Caledonia's dependence on the French company, and many Caledonians, especially amongst the political and economic elite, grew resentful of Le Nickel and its continual demands for tax and other concessions from the territorial government to fund its expansion, even as it sent its profits back to France. By the end of the 1950s, therefore, a growing number of Caledonians wanted to break Le Nickel's monopoly on their nickel industry by opening the colony to investment from new, even foreign companies. So when INCO sent a delegation to explore opportunities in New Caledonia in 1959, it seemed that the stars were aligning. New Caledonians wanted new investment in their nickel industry, and INCO was looking for new projects outside of Canada to maintain its position at the heart of the global nickel industry, which was beginning to slide as other companies gained market share. In September of 1959, INCO proposed a joint venture with Le Nickel to mine and process nickel in New Caledonia, but Le Nickel rejected this proposal. Informal collaborators for much of the early 20th century, the two companies were by then competitors, and Le Nickel had no intention of letting its greatest rival access New Caledonia's vast nickel reserves, with which to continue dominating the industry. Le Nickel considered New Caledonia its own chasse gardée, or its exclusive preserve. INCO didn't give up, though. Despite exploring projects elsewhere, notably in Guatemala and later in Indonesia, New Caledonia remained INCO's main target throughout the 1960s and beyond. INCO executives continued to visit New Caledonia, continued to work with several of its petits mineurs, small, independent mining companies, and in 1965 announced plans for a new nickel project with the French aluminum company Pechiney. These efforts were enthusiastically welcomed by many in New Caledonia, including Maurice Lenormand, Édouard Pentecoste, Georges Châtenay, and especially the Union Calédonienne, the local political party that dominated the elected territorial assembly. They wanted INCO established in New Caledonia. INCO, however, faced hostility not only from Le Nickel, but importantly from the French government under Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle and Georges Pompidou and Jacques Foccart and a bunch of others wanted New Caledonia's nickel industry left in the hands of a French company, i.e. Le Nickel, in order to protect French interests. While it opposed any foreign investment in New Caledonia's nickel industry, de Gaulle's government opposed INCO in particular for three main reasons. It worried that access to New Caledonian nickel reserves would cement INCO's dominance of the nickel industry at the expense of Le Nickel and French industrial interests. It also worried that INCO represented the vanguard of American economic and political interests in New Caledonia and in the French Pacific more broadly. And thirdly, many, though not all, of INCO's most vocal supporters in New Caledonia also wanted greater autonomy from France, notably Maurice Lenormand and the Union Calédonienne. For de Gaulle and others within the French state, INCO represented a real threat to French interests in New Caledonia and would boost its independence movement. Therefore, INCO had to be kept out of New Caledonia. On the other hand, local leaders were just as determined to welcome INCO to New Caledonia. In 1964, the Territorial Assembly refused any further tax breaks for Le Nickel until the French state allowed new investment. Then in July 1966, the Assembly adopted a memorandum denouncing Le Nickel and its monopoly, while enthusiastically endorsing foreign investment, especially by INCO. Only INCO, they argued, had the size, the market reach, the research capacity, the financial resources, and other assets to end New Caledonia's dependence on Le Nickel effectively while modernizing and reinvigorating the territory's nickel industry. This was the essence of New Caledonia's version of the nickel question. France wanted to keep the industry under French control. In contrast, many New Caledonians wanted INCO to establish a second company to reinvigorate the industry by breaking Le Nickel's monopoly. This issue dominated political affairs in New Caledonia throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s. And it had wide ramifications. Because the Territorial Assembly was dominated by the autonomist party, Union Caledonienne, which wanted INCO, the authorities in Paris concluded that the local government couldn't be trusted to defend French interests. And so, in 1963 and 1969, France revoked many of the powers of self-government that New Caledonia had obtained in 1956, in effect, recolonizing the territory. For its part, INCO was caught in the middle, as were its executives like Walter Kurlock. Even as it remained determined to invest in New Caledonia, INCO, it seemed, thought it needed New Caledonia as much as New Caledonians thought they needed INCO. There was thus a stalemate over INCO, but it could not last. Amidst mounting anger in New Caledonia, de Gaulle's government announced in 1967 the creation of a second nickel company, with INCO the major participant in the venture, though it took another 18 months to work out the details. Incidentally, de Gaulle's government came to this bitterly resented decision at the same time that de Gaulle visited Canada for Expo 67 in Montreal. You may remember that it was during this visit that de Gaulle made his infamous declaration of Vive le Québec libre, a declaration in favor of Quebec independence, from the balcony of Montreal City Hall. INCO's activities in New Caledonia, its influence on autonomists there, was very much on de Gaulle's mind when he visited Montreal, and I am persuaded by the evidence that de Gaulle's actions in Quebec in July of 1967 were influenced by what he saw, by what he considered INCO's encouragement of the autonomists in New Caledonia. In turn, de Gaulle's support for Quebec independence poised Canada-France relations for years to come. Nonetheless, in March of 1969, INCO and a consortium of French companies formed a joint venture called COFIMPAC, the Compagnie Française Industrielle et Minière du Pacifique, to mine and process nickel ore from the Goro area in the south of New Caledonia. Expected to start producing nickel in 1974, COFIMPAC faced problems right from the beginning. Some of these were technical. Goro's deposits were lower-grade laterite ores, for example, but 2.5 years of research and tests at INCO's J. Roy Gordon Research Lab in Mississauga and in pilot plants at Port Colborne determined that the carbonyl process was suited to processing these ores, with some modifications. COFIMPAC's biggest problems were structural and political, however. Because of the French government's desire to minimize INCO's influence in the company and in New Caledonia, it insisted on things like 1. Restricting INCO to minority or 40% ownership of the project, though the company contributed 60% of the funding and was responsible for all of the research and technical aspects of the project. Secondly, all of COFIMPAC's executives had to be French citizens, with French government approval required for the appointment of the company's president. Thirdly, INCO had to keep a low profile in New Caledonia, which meant few INCO employees were allowed there. COFIMPAC's biggest problem, though, was its ownership structure. Because no one French company was interested in leading the venture, the majority ownership, 60%, of COFIMPAC, was held by a holding company named Samipac, in which 12 different French companies owned shares, including Eugene Kuhlmann, Schneider, several banks, and a state agency, the Bureau de Recherche Géologique et Minière, the BRGM. Samipac's purpose was to keep INCO from controlling COFIMPAC, and thus to keep COFIMPAC French. But none of these companies had any experience with the nickel industry or any real commitment to the project. That became a problem when the nickel boom of the late 1960s came to an end in the early 1970s. As costs mounted and prospects dimmed, many of the French partners pulled out, tried to reduce their stake, or hesitated to contribute their share of the costs. The Coffenpack project was shelved in December of 1971 and abandoned completely a couple of years later. Coffenpack had been a marriage of convenience, designed to meet the political goals of the French government. It could not survive the stresses caused by a downturn in the industry. Yet Coffenpack did accomplish its primary goal. Its failure kept INCO from establishing itself in New Caledonia and Goro for several more decades, though at the expense of even more political difficulties in the territory, with many Caledonians blaming the government's hostility to INCO for Coffenpack's collapse. INCO remained in New Caledonia after Coffenpack's collapse, hopeful that it could persuade the French government to permit it to develop the Goro deposits itself. But that didn't happen. Still leery of INCO's size, power, and influence, the French government wanted INCO to form another joint venture, possibly with ELF, later ELF Aquitaine, or to split the Goro deposits between two different projects, neither of which was acceptable to INCO. And so the Goro deposits and INCO's interest in them remained in limbo. But hopes and expectations for a Goro project continued to build. In the meantime, while INCO waited for Goro, it undertook a much smaller project that helped the company maintain a presence in the territory. In the late 1960s, it had acquired a company called Société Le Tiebaghi that had operated a large chromite mine in New Caledonia's north. With chromite prices rising rapidly in the 1970s, INCO began planning to reopen the mine using vertical retreat mining, a new technique recently developed at its mines in Sudbury. The Tiebaghi mine reopened in 1983 and operated for 7 years before closing again in 1990. On a small scale, this project fulfilled its objectives. It brought good-paying jobs and economic activity to a part of New Caledonia that badly needed both. It gave INCO direct experience operating a project in the New Caledonian context while using new techniques to access previously inaccessible deposits, and it allowed INCO to maintain a presence and its relationship with key stakeholders and leaders in New Caledonia while continuing to work towards Goro. And it made a small profit throughout. And yet, during the operation of the Tiebaghi project, INCO had to deal with labor unrest, an 8-day strike in 1986, workplace and industrial accidents, health and safety issues, and even cross-cultural issues. For example, it took several years of operation before the company granted its workers a holiday on December 4th, a traditional holiday in the mining industry in New Caledonia, but one that's not celebrated in North America. Moreover, the best paid jobs all went to Canadian or European expats, and the profits were themselves largely repatriated, while decisions about the mine's future were made in New York or Toronto. These were the types of complaints that had been leveled against Le Nickel for decades. INCO's record on these issues was no worse than other mining companies, and probably better than many. But that's the point. INCO had enjoyed a stellar reputation in New Caledonia for decades, with many lauding the company for its world-beating operations and capabilities, and expecting it to transform the industry in New Caledonia. It wasn't really expected to be a company just like any other, profit-driven, externally directed, and beset by the problems common to all large mining and industrial concerns. INCO continued to enjoy a font of goodwill and high expectations in the territory, even after it closed the chromite mine at Tiebaghi. But the Tiebaghi experience revealed that INCO was not likely to be the shining knight of New Caledonia's mining industry that many New Caledonians hoped it would be, just as New Caledonia embarked on a new stage in its development with the signing of the Matignon Accords in 1988, under which INCO finally obtained, in 1995, approval to develop its Goro project. So what does it all mean? What's the point? In the title for this talk, I described the relationship between INCO and New Caledonia as codependent. This is a bit tongue-in-cheek, a description of connections between the two that lasted, directly or indirectly, for 100 years, almost the entirety of the 20th century. Surprisingly, those connections didn't actually involve INCO producing any real nickel in the Pacific Territory, but they depended upon each other for their well-being nonetheless. In the 1960s, they went further and each decided that they needed each other. INCO needed New Caledonia and its nickel reserves to secure its prosperity, and New Caledonia needed INCO to break its dependence on Le Nickel and revitalize its nickel industry. In the process, they built up ultimately unrealistic expectations of what each would do for the other, expectations that made it harder to define what a successful Goro project looked like once it got underway in the late 1990s. And that created disappointment for both INCO and New Caledonians when those expectations proved difficult to meet. Roland Gilbert, who was INCO's managing director in New Caledonia in the 1970s and 1980s, described the COFIMPACT project as the best project that INCO ever had, precisely because it never got off the ground. He felt the project, with all of its difficulties, would have been a burden rather than a blessing for the company. In the same way, Laurent Châtenay, another INCO Oceanie executive I interviewed, believed that INCO's work on Goro in the 1990s and early 2000s was much harder than it might have been because of the disillusionment that had set in, as many New Caledonians realized their expectations of INCO and the project would not be realized. It is hard enough getting a mining and metallurgical project up and running. It's even harder and more complicated when burdened with sky-high expectations developed over the course of decades. Again, history matters. Thank you very much.